The Western Riverside Council of Governments, or WRCOG. While you may have never heard of this organization, it has contributed to road improvements all over the region. WRCOG Deputy Executive Director Chris Gray joins us to talk about how WRCOG has shaped our transportation infrastructure and also to discuss how changing demographics will shape our communities into the future. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned.
This is the Calimesa Insider Podcast, the original Pass Area City podcast, focusing on the ins and outs of your city government at work. And now here's the host of Calimesa Insider, City Manager Will Kolbow.
Hello again, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day on this Friday, February 14th. And it's finally starting to clear up. It's been pretty rainy nonstop over the last day and a half or so, but it's finally clearing up. So hopefully you came through the storm okay. So where public works crews have been keeping an eye on things to make sure there's if there's damage out there, or if there's flooding, that they're taking care of business. So rest assured your city is on top of it. Now, before we get to our interview with Chris Gray today, I did want to give you a couple of items to think about. First of all, we will be having our next city council meeting on Tuesday, February 18th at 6 p.m. at the Norton Yoglove Senior Center. Please note that the meeting will be on Tuesday rather than the usual Monday due to President's Day. Among the items that we're going to be talking about or having on the agenda is a presentation from Dave Armstrong, the general manager of the South Mesa Water Company. We will also be swearing in a new city attorney, Stephen Flower. So he's from the same firm, Richards, Watson, and Gershon, just a different partner from that firm. And our current city attorney, for the next few days anyway, Quinn Barrow, will continue to provide services to the city. And then on a timely topic that we're going to talk about a little bit later, an ordinance to update the Transportation Uniform Mitigation Fee, or TUMF ordinance, which is required by WRCOG. We'll be approving that. And we'll talk more about the subject in our interview with Chris Gray. Now, I did want to do a quick follow-up on the podcast on taxes, the last couple of episodes we've had. I saw a comment, they asked about County Line Road and, wanted to go, to something a little more relevant like County Line Road, because it's like, this is all interesting and a little bit really doesn't apply to us. Well, here's the thing. It's absolutely relevant. Here's why. The federal government, again, is bringing in over $14,000 per person. The state government is bringing in over $7,000 per person. That's a lot of money. So anytime there's talk about any type of tax increase, there's an outcry. And yet your city government, which provides more services that directly impact your life, takes in less than $1,000 per person. What most people think, though, is that the government, small g, takes in $22,000 a person. So if I'm paying so much, why isn't the city doing X, Y, or Z, as if we have access to all of that money? And this is why it's relevant. Most of the money leaves the local area and very little that comes back in direct benefits to the city. That is what people should be concerned about. We as a city are expected to provide 24/7 police and fire services, roads, parks, community events, stormwater cleaning, library, animal control, and more for a fraction of what you are paying to the state and federal government. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say you pay too little in taxes. That's not my call to make. Everyone will give you a different number. Some will say it's zero. Others may say certain segments of the economic scale should pay more, and everything in between. But understanding where it all goes and how it impacts the city's ability to provide all of those services I mentioned is very relevant to everything that we do and how we look at development and the associated costs and benefits. So that's what I just wanted to say about that. I think it's really important for our community to understand that. So with that, we're going to go to our interview with Chris Gray from WRCOG. Joining us on the program today is Deputy Executive Director for WRCOG, Chris Gray. Thanks for joining us on the program, Chris.
Thanks a lot. Well, I'm happy to be here.
So, Chris, before we get into...
So I have a 30-year career in the transportation planning local government field. I spent 20 years as a private sector consultant. And then in 2015, I moved over to WRCOG. So I have a I think, a really good mix of public sector and private sector experience. So I see how the private sector, things that work in the private sector, and what I've tried to do is, um, bring some of those concepts forward. I have a strong analytical background because I used to be the person writing traffic studies and parking studies and collecting data. And I started my career as the guy standing on the street corner counting left turns. So I've been involved in transportation at every level, and even California, throughout the state, even internationally. So I've seen how different regions and even different countries solve transportation problems, and what it brings to me is how important transportation is to everyone, whether it's Calimesa or San Francisco or Singapore. They're all dealing with the same issues of people need to get around, um, whether it's by bus, car, plane, train, automobile, whatever that is. Transportation is a fundamental part of our life and our economy, and that's why I'm in the field I am, because it's so important. And being at WRCOG now lets me have a more direct hand in what gets funded, I'm not just the one doing the studies, I'm the person who's able to work with our local agencies to get projects moving forward.
Yeah, and you do a great job for us. I think I've always told you every time I have a conversation, I learn something, from all your knowledge and experience, and just a lot of common sense. You're very pragmatic in your approach. So that's something that I certainly really appreciate about your approach to transportation issues and regional issues. So we really appreciate the work that you do in Calimesa.
Yeah, and it's all about you. It's all about our members. And for me, so I'm a 20-year resident of Riverside County. I moved down here in 2005. I was born in Canada. I lived in Florida for a number of years. I have no desire to live anywhere other than where I live now. And if it wasn't for some taxation issues and cost of living issues, I would probably plan on living here the rest of my life. But I feel like Western Riverside County Riverside County Hall is just a genuine, authentic place. And, you know, you have people who are working hard, trying to improve their communities, and they're just making their way through their daily lives. And whatever I can do to make it better for them or easier for them, I'm happy to do that.
That's great. So, we talked about WRCOG. There's a lot of people maybe that are listening to this podcast that don't know what WRCOG is. So can you just tell us a little bit about the history of WRCOG and what it does?
Yeah. So one thing I want to start off with is WRCOG is a joint powers authority, and joint powers authorities are set up so that different uh, levels of government, but in this particular case, local government voluntarily come together. So no one's required to be in WRCOG. And so in the late 80s, a number of our elected officials at the time, some of them were county supervisors, some of them were local city mayors, and really in the late 80s is when development in Riverside County was really taking off. So a number of our cities were incorporated, particularly in southwestern Riverside County. They were facing significant growth. And there was a decision by the local elected officials that they really needed to have a body that could come together and talk about regional issues. So WRCOG was formed in 1991, so we're coming up on our 35th year. And we've always been that body where people could discuss issues. And then we moved from being the body where people would discuss issues to being an agency that does things. And so what we have positioned ourselves to be is the agency that helps you do the things that you need to do in a way that's cost effective, and we really bring economies to scale. And so, for example, the state requires recycling of used motor oil, and there are certain requirements you have for reporting. There's certain things you have to do, and we 20 years ago got a grant to do that on a regional basis. And so we run programs, we do outreach, and we actually do events where we give people you know oil filters so they can change their own oil. And so that's a case where you're required to do something, or you need to do something, or want to do something, and rather than doing it yourself, we do it on your behalf. And what that lets us do, instead of everyone, for example, having a staff person knows about used oil recycling, we have one person in the region, and they are an expert at that. They do that, and really WRCOG in a nutshell. It's helping you do the things you need to do at a cost-effective level, bringing economies of scale, and then having people who are really expert in that field to do that work so it can be done as effectively and efficiently as possible.
And that's something that, in particular, that a city like ours appreciates, because we are small. We don't have a big staff. So being able to have a partner that can do some of those things and do the heavy lifting for some of the things that we're required to do, we have just as much of a requirement to do that as Riverside, Corona, all the big cities in our region. So it really helps us out in particular in those type of programs.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The state doesn't differentiate between big cities and small cities. And the state has this wonderful habit of passing one size fits all laws. And whether you have the capacity to do it or you have the trained staff to do it, they don't care. That's really not an issue to them. And where we really stepped into this space is, because first of all, you have to understand, so the state passes new law. Well, what does it mean? You have to understand what it does. You have to look at your staffing. Do I have someone who can do this? And oftentimes, especially for the small cities, that means finding someone who already has a job, is already doing something, and tasking them with doing that other thing too. And then, since they're doing that with 15 other things, they don't always have the expertise or the knowledge or even the time to dedicate to that. And while I'd wish that particularly the state government would stop passing laws that make you all do something, unfortunately, it's a fact of life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's always been a constant fight, and I feel like it's getting even worse. So one of the things obviously you talked about early on was was transportation. And so one of the signature programs of the WRCOG, which is a little bit unique for Southern California and maybe even the state, is this Transportation Uniform Mitigation Fee Program, or TUMF. So tell us a little bit about the history of TUMF and where it came from.
So TUMF really came out of a series of lawsuits. And so what happened is there was rapid growth in the county and Southwest Riverside County in the mid to late 90s and other parts of the county. And the way they were resolving their issues is they were suing each other. And so the one jurisdiction would sue another, and then they would sue each other back. And so a couple of our county supervisors, a couple of our local city mayors got together and said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so they came up with this idea of, let's not all run our own traffic fee program. Let's have a regional program. And it started in 2003, and it's, been in operation since then. We've completed 150 projects. We've funded 150 projects. And what we have, there are some signature infrastructure projects around the region that we're currently funding or have funded. You drive through Banning, the I-10 Highland Springs interchange. We're funding the studies on that. We funded the Sunset Avenue grade separation in Banning. We're going to be giving the city funding for the I-10 Cherry Valley Boulevard interchange. And so it's really about, so it goes back to the economies of scale. Instead of you collecting money from your developers for your transportation infrastructure that other people use, we take the money from everyone and we pool it together. And what that means is, especially for the smaller cities, you can leverage resources other folks have, because if it were entirely up to your development, you oftentimes couldn't build a lot of these projects. And so the way our program, for example, we call it the pass area, is all the money that's collected by Banning, Beaumont, Calimesa, and the county around gets pooled into a single fund. And that then goes to fund projects. One of the important design decisions they made, which was actually genius, is WRCOG doesn't actually decide on how the money is allocated. TUMF has a governance system. It's been this way since the inception, where the money comes to WRCOG, and really we're just a program administrator. And the actual money gets spent. The decision to allocate money gets done at the local level, and then the project delivery is done by the local agency. So we are, it's a way of respecting local control and local expertise, because we're not the people actually building the thing. So we're not going to tell you how to build it. And we're not going to be the one to say, Calimesa, you get money, and Banning, you don't. It's a mutual decision. And so a lot of the decision-making in TUMF is based on consensus. And a lot of times there are people, we see a lot of interaction between our members, which we would like to facilitate, but not be in the case of telling one city they get funded and the other. Really, it should be done through a consensus-based process.
Right. And so there is a kind of a breakdown of that. Some of the money goes to the zone, but that there's some of the money goes to other places. And so tell us about kind of the breakdown of where the funds kind of how they get divvied up in that way.
So for every dollar that comes in, 46 cents of it goes to the zone. So if you collect $1 in Calimesa, 46 cents out of that dollar goes to the pass area, which is you and your neighbors. 46 cents of that goes to RTTC. 4% comes to WRCOG for administration. 3 cents goes to RTA, the transit agency, and 1.5 cents goes to the conservation agency. And so the idea is, since traffic is regional, which means people in Calimesa don't stop at city boundaries, they travel to other parts. So people in Calimesa will drive to Riverside, they'll drive to Rainbow Valley. You import a lot of your, so the jobs in Calimesa, you're importing workers from other locations. They don't all come from your city. And so the idea is that by mixing those funds and having them go to a variety of sources, we're addressing, issues on a regional level.
Right. That does make a lot of sense. So how is the program funded? We talk about, actually, it's timely that we're talking about this because we are actually taking an update to our TUMF ordinance, which all the member agencies that participate in TUMF are required to have. We're taking that to our council this Tuesday. So tell us about where the money comes from.
So TUMF is a one-time charge on development. So when someone comes in and pulls a building permit to build a new house, a new warehouse, a new shopping center, they pay a one-time fee. That fee is never paid again. So if you go to buy an existing house, you don't pay the fee. You build a new house, you pay the fee once. And in terms of your residents, they don't actually pay the fee unless something is built. And so once something is built, then actually the developer of that site, not the resident, they pay the fee. So if you, for example, build a new home, the developer who is pulling the permits, building the home, pays the fee. I will say that the fee does get rolled into the cost of that home, but that only happens. And when you buy that house or sell that house, there's no additional fees. You're not paying ongoing fees. It's not a sales tax. So if you are not buying a new home, you are not paying this fee. And so the idea is we want developers to pay to mitigate the impact they're generating from their new developments. So if they're getting the profit from building that house, they should pay for their impact. And so a part about TUMF is you can't use it for maintenance. You can't use it to fix existing problems. It's for new problems caused by new development. And so TUMF exists within a larger, I call it, transportation funding ecosystem. You have state and federal money, you have sales tax money, you have gas tax money, and then you have TUMF. So your resident might be paying taxes to the state and federal government. They get some of that back as transportation dollars. They pay taxes on the gas every time they pay a sales tax when that goes toward transportation. But your average resident, TUMF has no impact on them at all, and what they really see are the benefits.
Right. And I think that's where, the only way it may affect it, and, I think you've done a lot of presentations on this issue when, there's a nexus study that's prepared that determines what projects are needed to accommodate future growth, and how much those cost. And you kind of divvy it up, and there's different categories, correct? To kind of tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when we look at the kind of projects we fund, first of all, we only do capacity enhancing. So that can be new interchanges or widening existing interchanges. So Prairie Valley Boulevard, I-10 interchange is the expansion of existing interchange. Then we fund new roadways and new expansions. So for example, the city of Banning is proposing to extend Sun Lakes Boulevard. So that's a project funded by TUMF. We fund bridges, we fund grade separation. And so that's the kind of projects it funds. What we don't fund are local streets. We don't fund, your repaving the streets, which are all really important, things need to do, but we're not building the driveway to the person's house. We're building that arterial or that interchange that someone's using to get off the freeway or get to the entrance to their development. But once that, that actual road that's going to their house and their driveway is not funded by TUMF, because that's not regional transportation infrastructure. That's the responsibility of the local jurisdiction, and in case of new development, it's the responsibility of the developers to build those local streets.
And so this is what is referred to as a development impact fee. And the city also charges a number of those fees. The water districts charge those fees. The school district charge those fees. So, there is sometimes a misunderstanding or there's I guess maybe it is just a misunderstanding that development doesn't pay their way. They're not building anything. But you're paying into all these different development impact fees. We have one for parks, libraries, police, fire. We have our own local transportation diff fee. And so there's a number of diff fees that are paid. But a lot of times people have this complaint about why isn't infrastructure built before development comes? Can you maybe explain that a little bit and why that is? I have kind of an idea of what that is, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So there's a variety of Supreme Court cases and state law about, when you can charge the fee. And so I can't legally go to a developer who's maybe going to build in 10 years and say, we need you to pay us right now, because they're not ready to pay. I mean, we can't legally collect that far back. So it's the state law. And the bigger issue, though, is we woefully underfund transportation system. And one point I'd like to make is the state and federal government used to fund a lot more of the local transportation system. And, the state of California used to be in the business of building freeways, and they don't do that anymore. So when you have a system where you legally can't charge them before they start building, and then you don't have the other funding sources coming to you to be able to proactively build that infrastructure, you're stuck in a position where you're really the only choice available to you is to go in and fix it after the fact. And I would love to say that, we are building infrastructure before the development comes in, but a lot of cases we're not. And the other thing that doesn't help is the various, state and federal requirements related to infrastructure is that it can literally take us 20 years from start to finish on a project. I've seen some projects, big interchanges, that close to 30 years. And by the time you meet all those requirements of the state and federal government, and so what I really see is we're kind of getting the double whammy from them. So they're not giving us the money they used to, then they're imposing all these requirements on us. And so no wonder something will take 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And where it gets even worse is a lot of our agencies get in this vicious cycle of they want to build a project, they don't have enough money, they raise the money, the project cost goes up. They have to raise more money, the project cost goes up. They have to raise more money, the project cost goes up. And so that, the longer you wait to do something, the more expensive it always is.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I hear from some residents, this is not a huge argument that I hear, but I do hear some rumblings of it, is that the quote unquote, the city built X, Y, and Z for this developer. And again, usually these are almost always coming from development impact fees that those developers paid, or they were conditioned to build on their own. So it's not just about them paying a diff, fee to pay for those projects that their impacts have. Sometimes we condition the developers, or a lot of times we do condition developers to do certain things. For example, someone builds something on a 2-lane road that ultimately is supposed to be a 4-lane road. We will make them build to the ultimate width and dedicate that right of way as part of their conditions of approval. And so sometimes you'll see places where all of a sudden the road's really wide in front of just this one business. And it's because that business is newer. And so those are the kind of some of the nuances that people don't understand. But again, it's not coming from your own tax dollars directly necessarily. It's a lot of times coming either from the developer directly or from fees that they pay.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so what the I understand the frustration people feel, and one thing I would point out is that if you look at the history of impact fees in California, they're significantly higher than they used to be. And if you look at how they've progressed over time, there's actually a couple of big jumps. And one big jump is when they instituted Prop 13. And so after that, that forced local government to rely more heavily on impact fees. And then when the state took away redevelopment, you saw another inflection point. And so what happened over time is as the state, so think about this, the state has all these requirements they make us do. Then they don't give us the same level of funding they used to, and now they constrain our ability to fund infrastructure. So nobody should be surprised that you get these situations. So you're absolutely right. A lot of jurisdictions, Calimesa is no exception. Part of their infrastructure delivery process is having developers build those projects. And so does it cause inconsistencies where a road might go from 2 or 4, or maybe even 6 lanes per segment and then back to 2? Yeah, and that's the challenge you have. And we try to address that through TUMF, because the idea is, if that road really needs to be widened in Calimesa, it's likely that that road is also used by people from Banning and Beaumont, or people who live in the county. And if we're all going to use that road, we should all be paying for it. And so TUMF is a way to help out, but it really goes back to the state not paying its fair share, the state constraining your revenue, and then imposing additional requirements on us that just escalate the cost of the project. And
Right.
it's not surprising to me that projects don't get delivered. It's surprising to me when things do get done, because of all the hoops you have to jump through, all the how costly it is, and it and all the various requirements and obligations you have. So that, to me, I'm amazed by how creative our local agencies are in terms of getting asphalt on the ground, getting bridges built. And so kudos to you all for figuring out how to make network in a very complicated system that no one's making easier for you.
Yeah, and when we have conversations about these things and let them know about these challenges, the response is always, well, then don't allow any more development then. Well, that's also not an answer, right? Because now, in addition to the state putting more and more requirements on us when we do build transportation infrastructure, at the same time, and this is something that you and I have had plenty of conversations about, at the same time, the state is imposing all of these things that we have to encourage and mandate development while actually restricting our ability to accommodate for that growth.
Yeah. And I would also say too, the thing I would say to people is like, well, don't allow any more building, is you don't want your city to become static. And when we look at communities that are thriving, there's a certain amount of growth. And so what you want to do is you want to have that right balance between, you want growth that's consistent with the character of the city. You want a certain amount of development because homes brings retail. And if you want more shopping and dining opportunities in your city, you got to have more homes. And if you stop growing, and we've seen cities that stop growing, they really stagnate. And do you want to live in a city that's stagnant and is not going to change for 20 years? Because the stagnation means that things actually get worse. And so if you're not having development, you're not having new homes built, and you create this vicious cycle where you're not allowing new homes to be built. And so then the old homes get, your home housing stock ages, they become less attractive. It becomes less attractive for people to move there, people move out. And then people who moving in aren't necessarily the same socioeconomic status as people who were there before. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen in places like, Midwest. We've seen that happen in, Detroit, places like that, where they have lost a sizable fraction, 30 to 50% of their population. And when you stagnate and don't grow, that's the future. That oftentimes is the future you end up with. And we can see that already in Southern California. You can see, for example, in certain cities in Orange County where they're, very nice places to live, but they're not growing, they're not building. And all is happening is the population is getting older. you're not getting younger people moving into the community. Nobody's going to school anymore. And then people, they want the status quo and they don't necessarily want to pay for, um, they're not going to pay for new infrastructure. They certainly, they don't even want to maintain what they have. And then, so once that happens, then you start to lose revenue. And, we've seen enough examples of that to know how that cycle works. And not having any development at all puts you in that cycle.
Right. And I talked, you mentioned Prop 13. I actually did some, talked about that a little bit in a past episode on the podcast, because I think that that's the other side of that, of what you're describing, is because of the structure, or because of the tax structure in our state and the limitations that Prop 13 places on that, our revenues, if you don't grow, our revenues are always going to trail behind the growth of our expenses. So if you just, everything grows at the rate of inflation, you're already behind the eight ball, because Prop 13 is limited to 2% on growth. And if you don't have a lot of turnover or addition to your development, your housing stock, what have you, you're going to just fall behind, even if everything else stays equal, and not even, thinking about the aging infrastructure, the aging homes, and what that does. Just the impacts itself of that law also contribute to kind of falling behind and actually having to cut services on top of the issues that you described.
Yeah. So I think there's two things I want to highlight. Is the important caveat about Prop 13 is essentially in most circumstances when the home sells, it resets to that higher value. So what that means is you want to have your homes turning over. You want to have people moving into your community, and you want to have, it's not just new homes being built. It's people building those, buying those existing homes and driving up that demand. Because if you have a vibrant, growing community, people will want to live there. And so the home prices will rise. I would say that the further issue with Prop 13 is, and you know this very well, is you don't actually get that much money from property taxes. Most of the property taxes go to the school, they go to the state. I, for example, on my personal home, I pay $5,000 in taxes to various CFDs and CSAs. So what's happening is we're paying them different ways. We're just not paying it to you, and that then forces you to collect the money some other way for the things we're asking you to do for us. No one walks into the city council and says, we have too many police. I don't think we need, we have 10 officers on duty at a time. Oh, 7 should be fine. They're like, we have 10, we want 15. And when
Right.
your revenues are constrained, you don't get 15, you get 7. And the only way you get the 15 officers that people want is you have to cut something else. And that's not a great fiscal model to be in. So in the end, you got to have some level of growth. So what I've always advocated for, and I call it responsible growth. And so you have planned, orderly growth. Kind of what's happening. If it's too fast, you meter it. If it's too slow, you do what you can to incentivize it. But, Will, I think you and I've talked about this before. There's not a lot you can do to make anyone build faster. Almost all of our residential growth is driven by large home builders. It's between 95 and 90% of all of our residential permits are being pulled by these large companies. There are 4 home building companies on the Fortune 500, which means they're one of the 500 largest companies in the world. And 3 of them are in Riverside County. So when you have a company whose revenue is in the tens of billions of dollars, the ability of any city, I don't care if it's Calimesa or Riverside or even LA, to get them to build more is really low. And so a lot of this is happening in things beyond your control. So people are like, well, we don't want to build here. At best, you can slow it down and maybe stop it temporarily. But if there's a desire to build in your community, they're going to do that. And what happens is that they're not building in Calimesa, then they're going to build in Banning, or they're going to build in the county. So what that means is you're going to get the traffic and you get the impact, and you're not going to get any money out of that. Like
Right.
you might get some of it through TUMF, but you're not going to get the benefits. And so, what we noticed when we look at growth patterns over the last 20 years is that if one city tries to constrain the level of development and there's demand there, it pops up in their neighbors. And so the same level of development happens regardless of what one particular city does. If it's economical for them to develop and they'll make their profit on that home, they're going to build that home one way or another.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, because that's exactly what has happened in Calimesa versus Beaumont. Their population went from what we are now at about 11,000 just 20 years, in 2000, to over 50,000 by 2020. I mean, they had a fivefold growth when a lot of that growth was ironically in the same exact specific plan that was originally slated for the western part of our city. So I think that's exactly what we saw happen here in Calimesa.
Yeah,
So
and it's I can understand the frustration of a lot of times they're not asking you to grow faster, they're asking you to not grow because they see a lot of negative aspects with growth. But I think if you really dig into the fiscal model, is a city that's not growing isn't sustainable, because if you're not getting it, you're right, you're not getting additional revenues, there's inflation, so you got to start paying. Costs don't stay static, costs don't go down, and we've seen that happen, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. Costs have gone up significantly. So, for example, uh, we looked at the materials for road building, steel, concrete. Some of those costs have tripled over the past 5 or 6 years. And, and so if your revenue is not going up, you gotta then you're forced to do less.
right, right. And this kind of segues into kind of another topic that you've talked about. You've gone to different chambers of commerce and different groups and given a presentation on regional demographics and development trends. So we don't need to go into the entire, presentation, but what are some of the key takeaways that you've learned, that you've seen, that are impacting us going forward?
Yeah, the big thing that we're starting to talk about as a society is really the age, the aging of our population. So, a lot of what's driving that is two things: is people are living longer, and birth rates are down. Birth rates have been down every year since 2008. And to throw out a quick stat, there's a stat they track worldwide. It's called TFR, total fertility rate, and that's the number of women, a number of children each woman need to have to keep the population stable, and that number is 2.1. So yes, every woman needs to have 2.1 children. How you have the 0.1, I don't know, but right now in the U.S. we're at like 1.7, and um, no state in America is above 2. And when we look around the world, we are much better off than most places. Most of Europe is at 1 or 1.2. Most of Asia is below 1. And there isn't a lot government can do to make people have more families, make people have more children. So what that means is we're still going to see the same growth, just not the same kind of people. So, that's the macro issue. But what we do see is a lot of what I call self-selection. And I know that we have families moving to the past because of affordability and quality of life. And so you're going to have people that are a lot more discriminate, that really they're going to pick where they live. And what they're going to do is they may or may not have children, but they're going to have money, they're going to have assets, and they're going to look around and say, well, where do I feel safe? Where's the community I want to live in? Where's the community I want to be proud of? And if you're not on the list, they're not going to move there. Particularly with remote work and other people's flexibility in terms of schedules, and think about people who are entrepreneurs, is like, you can live wherever you want. And if Calimesa is not attractive for you to move there and you don't feel proud of living in there, you're going to go somewhere else. You might move out of state. And so what we've been tracking is most of our population growth is not from birth, it's from people from other parts of California moving here. And there's a lot of people from LA and San Diego and Orange County moving to Riverside County, particularly western Riverside County. And that's really what's driving our population growth. And one of the challenges is oftentimes they have higher incomes and they're able to come and buy a home for cash. For someone who lives in a neighborhood in Orange County where the home sell for $2 million, coming out here and buying a home for 500,000 or 600,000 is like, it's not a challenge for them. They might even have all that money. They might have had that $2 million home, and let's say they got $600,000 in equity. Well, they're going to come out here and buy that house for cash. And so when we look at people moving out of, I call the high cost of living areas, the LAs, Orange County, San Diego's, they tend to move to 3 places: Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Riverside County. So that's an important thing because one thing that really impacts are the schools. And so I've done presentations at the school districts, and you're not going to necessarily get the same number of kids you are, unless that's a place where families want to live. Then you might get way more kids than you planned, but that may not be permanent. And so you might get these periods, these kind of peaks and valleys where you get a lot of families with children moving into an area. And that's really what I see happening in the past is that it's really the affordability and the home prices. It's one of the few places in your county where you can buy a house for $500,000 or less. And that's really, unfortunately, that's our starter home. And so they're moving out here, and they're also moving out here because they can get bigger homes. And instead of a 1,500 square foot apartment or condo in LA or county, they're moving out here to buy that 2,000, 2,500 square foot home because it gives their family room to live, and they feel comfortable and they feel safe, and they want to be here. If they didn't want to be here, they'd go somewhere else. And so one of the things I suggested is cities really need to. A lot of cities have business protection strategies, and I'm suggesting you need to think about resident attraction and retention strategies. You have to give compelling reasons for people to move, because if they're mobile and they're not going to move to, very few people are going to move to cities anymore because they have to, it's because they want to. And I think that's a much different mindset than a lot of cities have.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That is a good point. And you actually mentioned businesses, and so kind of shifting gears a little. We were talking a lot about housing and whatnot. But another big issue that is something that's an unpopular issue for many cities, not just Calimesa. I think every city seems to think that they're unique, that they don't want warehouses. But I don't know of any place where you're going to have residents going, I want more warehouses. There's not enough warehouses here. So one of the things that in the Nexus study, going back to TUMF a little bit as well, is the change in the rates for the different uses. And industrial was kind of a sticking point for some people. It actually generated a couple of public comments, even, which is relatively rare for something that the COG is doing. Talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the misnomers of terms of trip generations, traffic, things like that, but also, maybe some of the valid concerns that people have with warehouses in their area.
Yeah. So the thing to keep in mind is that no non-residential use generates trips without homes to support it. So if I put a Costco or a warehouse on an island and nobody lives there, it's not going to have any trips. And so when you look at travel patterns and travel surveys, what you notice is about 75% of all the trips are start or end at someone's house. And 25% of them are work trips, and the rest of them are people going to school, people shopping, all the things we do on a daily basis. And so when people look at the fees, they're like, oh, the warehouse fee is only $2 a square foot. So in the TUMF, it went from about $1.90 to $2.30, which is about a 30-40% increase. The base residential fee went from 10,000 to 15,000. So it appears that it's out of whack, but it's really proportional to how much development that we see coming and the various trips. Keep in mind that a million square foot warehouse is going to pay close to $3 million in TUMF fees, and they are not dating through without paying those fees. The other thing, and I've said this at a number of council meetings, is TUMF does not address all of the other impacts that are associated with trucks. And while we don't like warehouses, what people really don't like are the big trucks. Trucks damages the road, trucks cause air quality issues, all kinds of other things. And that's not part of TUMF. And so what we've advocated for is that people should pay their fair share of every kind of impact from developers. And so if you're going to add a bunch of trucks to a road, you need to compensate the city for all that damage. Because if you look at roadway maintenance, the thing that really drives, having to repave a road that really damages the road is trucks. The more trucks you have, the worse the condition it is, and the more often you have to rebuild the road. And I've seen roads that where heavy trucks have just destroyed that road, and it's not even repairable. It just almost needs to be replaced. And so I don't disagree that warehouses have impacts on air quality and the environment and noise. And so I think from our perspective, we're just addressing congestion. and we are using the best data we have. We've done our own surveys of warehouses. We have a much better understanding of warehouse travel behavior. And, what we're finding, for example, is the number of employees they have is going down. We did a survey of warehouses in 2018, and we redid that survey in 2003, and found on average they have about 30% less employees than they used to. So the other thing going on is we think if you extend that out, you might not have anybody working there. You might have a very small number of people working there. And so really it's just going to be the truck, going to and from. So that could potentially reduce the impact. But the final thing I'd say is, yet let ye who does not buy from Amazon criticize Amazon. It's a part of our daily lives. I've seen people become truly irate because they didn't get their item that they ordered through Prime next day. And if you think about everything we do comes off a truck. You go to the store to buy groceries, they came from a truck. You go to eat at a restaurant, where their food from, it came on a truck. It's not just the people buying from Amazon, it's our entire economy, it's our entire lifestyle is geared around having easy access to stuff when we want it. And people don't have the patience. So when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, we picked Christmas presents out of the Sears catalog. And we kind of go through the Sears catalog and circle the things, the toys we wanted to get. Then my parents would either go buy them in a toy store or order them. And I got some really cool toys back then. But now it's just here's my Amazon wish list. Get me the stuff on my wish list, and that's what people are used to. And so, if you're willing to change your lifestyle to accept a longer delay, accept less choices, then by all means have warehouses, because they're going to go somewhere. And so if they're not in Calimesa, they're going to be in Cherry Valley, or they're going to be in Beaumont, or they're going to be in Hemet or San Jacinto.
Right.
And we need to do the best we can to make sure that they're compensating everyone for the impact that they have. And that's all the impact. And I would love to say that TUMF is going to pick up the tab for all these other things, but legally we just can't do it. We can only charge for congestion. And it's up to the air district, it's up to the local agencies to really do everything they can to recover those fees. And so I've even seen, for example, cities looking at CFDs or community facilities districts, which assess fees on warehouse development, ongoing fees that they use for roadway maintenance. So that's an example of some, creative approaches that are some of our members are using or trying out. And I think there's a lot of that potentially could be really helpful, because there is no fee right now that collects for the kind of ongoing roadway maintenance impact unless you negotiate something special with the developers.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking too, because, you mentioned that the development impact fees can't, and TUMF can't be used for maintenance. And, the number of trips, the trip generation doesn't necessarily distinguish between a big rig truck and a passenger vehicle, which is driving the congestion, but certainly the impacts on the roads, which can't be paid for by development impact fees, certainly there is a difference, as you mentioned. So I think that the approach of having them pay their fair share and pay more into road maintenance because there is a greater impact absolutely makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I will say this is we're constantly looking for ways to refine our analytical tools. And one thing that we'll be doing, I hope to have in place by the next study, which we'll start in a year or so, is having a specific tool to analyze truck impacts by themselves. And it's very time-consuming and difficult to do that. And most agencies don't do that level of detail, but it's enough of an issue in the region, and a lot of it just comes back to legal defensibility. I mean, I know that we're not capturing all the impact on warehouses and trucks. I can't fix that within, the legal framework I have to operate under. So I have to tread very carefully. And so you can't arbitrarily, it's not legal against state law. You can't decide, what, I think that warehouse fee is too low, we're going to double it. And that, the state law that specifically regulates impact fees says you cannot increase it above the level called for the nexus study, but you can decrease the fee beyond the maximum. So when the nexus study was approved, the retail and service, so retail is, stores, anything that sells anything, service for everything from banks, offices, um, those kinds of things. That those fees aren't going up. A couple of our city managers and some of our elected officials have said we ask that those fees stay constant. So what we're really doing is putting all the new development on the back of residential and industrial, and we are always looking for ways to improve our analysis, improve our tools. And, this has been an issue for a long time. And, I know our profession is looking at, different data sources. And so, for example, trucks are all now tracked by GPS, and so we get a much better understanding of where the trucks actually go. But this is going to continue to be an issue because our lifestyle is all about buying stuff and getting stuff shipped to our houses and shipped to our stores. And until that changes, we got to live with trucks.
Yeah, and one thing that I wondered about that, and actually is a good point, because you mentioned about there's the birth rates are going down and things like that, and our wanting to consume more. We're definitely a consumerist society. With the birth rates going down, and at the same time you have people leaving the workforce, retiring, whatnot. Have we reached a point where we're actually having more people leave the workforce than we're having enter?
I know for specific professions that's happening. I don't know if we're having. I haven't actually looked at the numbers, but that's something I would like to look into. The thing I find interesting is, while our number of people, more people retiring and such, that doesn't mean they don't buy stuff. It just means they're not actively working. And so I see, a scenario where you might have people that aren't working, fewer and fewer people that are working, and more people that don't work regular hours or don't work full time, and they're still buying stuff. And, we've heard about, people retiring and then under-retiring, having to come back to the workforce. I think our whole model of, you start working when you're 20 and then you retire when you're 65 is completely different. You have people retiring at 40, you're gonna have people retiring at 80, you're gonna have people semi-retiring at 65, going back to work. And so that to me is just a complete change in how our mindset on people, I call it life cycle. When are they active, productive working adults? When are they not? We see kids or people in their early 20s still living at home. They might be living in their parents' home to their early 30s. I mean, that wasn't typical before. Now that's something we see happening a lot more. So,
right.
As I think it was Bob Dylan, times are changing, and one of the things that we try to do at WRCOG is really share information. And so it's a lot easier for us to do this analysis for the entire WRCOG region versus Calimesa having a staff person do it or hire a consultant. So it really is the same amount of time whether you do it for 18 cities or one city. And so that's why we've been sharing this demographic information, because I don't think that this is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. I think when you tell them about it, they say, "Oh yeah," and the schools are experiencing it, but I think a lot of people don't see it because it's somewhat gradual. They just don't see it and don't appreciate it.
Right. Yep. That's very true. Well, Chris, I appreciate your time. You spent a lot of time with us today and gave us a lot of insight. And I can say it again, I've learned something from today that I didn't know before. So I appreciate your insight, and I appreciate spending the time with us.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having me on here. I really appreciate it. As I said, we're here to help people and, the residents, the cities. I just want the region to be a better region for me and my family. And anything I can do in my role at WRCOG to do that, I am absolutely committed to. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And by the way, Chris Gray just informed me that they actually did do a podcast called the COGcast, COG at WRCOG for a little while. That ended back in 2021, but episodes are still available. So if you want to search for that, it's COGcast, all one word, if you want to listen to the archive of the WRCOG podcast. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Calimesa Insider podcast. Reminder, City Hall will be closed this coming Monday in observance of President's Day. And once again, our next City Council meeting will be this Tuesday, February 18th at the Norton Younglove Civic Center, that City Senior Center, that'll start at 6 p.m. Please note again that this is a different day due to the holiday. You can catch it live in person or on the city's YouTube page by going to calimesa.gov/YouTube. Subscribers, please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. And you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok, both at Calimesa Insider, all one word, where you can find highlights and bonus content for the show. Until next time, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you again next week. Take care.